thank you so much for being a part of this very, very important conversation. We're here in Washington today because we want to restore trust in Congress, we want to retire career politicians, and we want to give government back to the people where it belongs. So I'd like to introduce our panel right now. First, Senator Rand Paul is an ophthalmologist currently living with his family in Bowling Green, Kentucky, where Dr. Paul owned his own practice and performed eye surgery for 18 years. In 1995, Dr. Paul founded the Southern Kentucky Lions Eye Clinic, which provides eye exams and surgery to needy families and individuals. Senator Paul was first elected to the Senate in 2010 and was a candidate for president in 2016. He has been a leader and advocate of term limits throughout his time in public service. Please welcome Senator Rand Paul. Representative Beto O'Rourke was first elected to the House in 2012 to represent the 16th District of Texas. Representative O'Rourke serves on the Committee on Veterans Affairs and is the vice-ranking member on the Armed Services Committee. Representative O'Rourke founded Stanton Street Technology, an internet software company, in 1999. He previously served on the El Paso City Council from 2005 to 2011. Representative O'Rourke and Representative Blum, who's seated next to him, founded the Congressional Term Limits Caucus in 2015 and currently serve as co-chairs of that caucus. Welcome, Congressman O'Rourke.
Thank you.
Congressman Rod Blum, on the far left flank over there, is a career small businessman who represents Iowa's 1st District. He's the former CEO of Eagle Point Software and currently the owner of Digital Canal, a construction software company. Congressman Blum was first elected to Congress in 2014, and he serves on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. He's also chair of the Small Business Subcommittee on Agriculture, Energy, and Trade. Welcome, Congressman.
Thank you.
So I want to start with a topic that has been in the news these last few weeks. We've actually gotten more questions on this than anything else, and that is the allegations of sexual harassment against members of Congress and reports that millions in taxpayer dollars have been paid out to settle these claims. We've seen accountability for individual members of Congress. Yesterday, the longest-serving representative in Congress, John Conyers, resigned. We've also seen calls for removal and reimbursement. But Senator Paul, in a way, is this treating the symptom without treating the disease? I mean, isn't the real problem here that people are allowed to accumulate so much power for such a long time, which breeds arrogance?
Nobody told me we were going to be talking about sexual harassment today, but are they interrelated? You know, I think arrogance comes with time and maybe with too much time in office. On the actual issue, I have a host of mixed feelings on it, to tell you the truth, in the sense that should we have a secret fund that you can pay off sexual harassment claims on? No. I'm absolutely against that. But I also think it's a weird thing that we set up a standard and people abide by it, and they were told that these were the rules, and then we're going to change the rules afterwards. And so I don't think there's a good solution. Moving forward, I think obviously these things should be public. You know, the accuser shouldn't have to go to 6 months of counseling to make an accusation. So there's all kinds of things that can be changed. But I also worry about going back in time, and Ken might comment on this as a lawyer, that you know, when you play by a certain set of rules and you accept something, you accept a legal judgment, shouldn't there be a certain binding nature to that, that all of a sudden, is it really fair? Because, for example, all the people who settled these things, if they were told they're going to be hounded out of office, they would have probably fought the claim. So people would react in a lot different way, and you need to be fair to both sides, and nobody deserves to be harassed in their position and work, but at the same time, I don't know, I think we've gotten to, I don't know, now it's this presumption of guilt instead of presumption of innocence, and there is no real meaningful adjudication of all this stuff. I want to make Ken answer and follow up?
Well, as he often does for non-lawyer, Senator Paul touches on a lot of the process safety elements that are unique to the American system, frankly. Due process is what we call this stuff. And I do think when you look at somebody, look at the longest serving person involved in this, John Conyers, there's no question time in office seems to change people, or people change over time. And so when you run into an issue like this, there is a certain presumptuousness about the safety of their position. And from a legal standpoint, if you step out of this issue and just address it generally, the American system always rejected changing the rules after the fact. We call them ex post facto laws. You may have heard of that, reading your Constitution and such reading accompanying it. So I think that when the people invested with setting the rules, the laws, rules how they run the organization, but laws how we all have to live, and they settle in, I just think it's been observable over time that the longer they're there, the more they believe those very same laws don't apply to them. It's one of many reasons why term limits make sense, and I believe if the founders had it to do over again and could do one more thing, they would put in term limits for both judges and for legislators.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, no comment?
Yeah, I think, the longer you are here, the less connected you are to the people you represent, the less accountable, the less responsive. And the people in this country understand that and get that. And I think it helps to account for our historic low level of popularity, below communism, just above gonorrhea, somewhere in that sweet spot of 11%. Because once you're in, very hard to get you out. The people you represent know that, and you yourself know that. The re-election rate over the last 50 years for a member of Congress is about 93%. And I think that that continuous accumulation of power breeds corruption and corrupts the very ideals, as was mentioned, of our foundational documents of the Constitution, of our democracy, of the understanding that this is a temporary position, and that if we truly have faith in the people that we represent, then we would willingly get out of the way and allow someone to do just as good, more likely a better job than we've been able to do, and bring their unique set of experiences and expertise to bear on the problems and opportunities of the country. My favorite painting when I'm taking constituents from El Paso on a tour of the Capitol is General Washington resigning his commission at the time where he could have made a very strong popular case to be military dictator for life of the United States. And he doubled down on that precedent by leaving after 2 terms as president. I agree that principle should be enshrined in the Constitution. There's nothing exceptional about a member of Congress or a judge or anyone else in a position of public trust that should allow them to serve longer than 8 years would be my suggestion in the House, 12 years in the Senate. And I think that would go a long way towards curing a number of the ills that we see in this institution and beginning to restore people's faith in the Congress.
Thank you. You know, congressional term limits, if you don't already know this, is not just the most popular political issue in the United States, it's also the most bipartisan. It has support, according to polls, from 75% of Americans, including 67% of Democrats, 74% of Republicans, and 77% of independents. And yet, Congressman Blum, it doesn't get as much as even a hearing here on Capitol Hill, much less a vote on the floor. And I think most Americans are outraged by that, and we want to know what's going on. When will term limits finally see the light of day in Congress?
First of all, Nick, thank you for holding this event today and bringing term limits to the attention of the American people. I thought maybe today I would need protective detail coming to this event because we are talking about term limits on Capitol Hill, and probably going to need a food tester this coming week. I'm from the 1st District of Iowa, and it's an 80 to a 90% winner, term limits, that issue is. And you're right, it's Democrats, independents, Republicans, people want term limits. So, well, I've also been involved in, I'll call them drain the swamp bills, like tying our pay to the pay of the average American, ending the congressional pension program, for congressional members, ending first-class air travel paid for by the taxpayers, ending luxury car leases paid for by the taxpayers, and if we don't have a balanced budget, cutting our pay every year until we do have a balanced budget. And I'm guessing it might take a long weekend to end up with a balanced budget if we would ever get that passed into law. Now, all those bills are in the House. I'll speak for the House. None of them have been brought to the floor for a vote. Your question is why? It's a great question. The American people would like to know why. I'm not in leadership, and at least in the House, leadership controls what bills are brought to the floor for a vote. But I'm guessing, there's no incentive. There's no incentive for leadership to bring these bills to the floor for a vote. A lot of elected officials go back to their home districts and they say, I'm for a balanced budget, I'm for term limits, I'm for these various things, correct? And their plane crosses the Potomac and something switches in their mind. And I think they go to leadership and say, don't have a floor vote on these issues. Please don't make me go on record. And I'll just end by saying it's kind of like asking a turkey if they're for or against Thanksgiving. That's where we're at.
Senator Paul, have you had any discussions with leadership on the Senate side about bringing term limits up for a vote?
Well, I think you're right. The term limits are incredibly popular outside of Washington. Inside of Washington on Capitol Hill, not so much. We have 14 co-sponsors for our term limits amendment in the Senate. So while it polls at 75% in Peoria, it polls at 14% on Capitol Hill. And that's sort of the problem. And but I can say, having met most of the people who are up here, there are many good people up here. And I would say that there's no monopoly of knowledge up here. There are many good people who aren't. And some of the better people who are up here actually did have a career before they came up here. And there's a lot of young people in the audience. They always ask me, they say, I want to get involved in politics or I want to run for office someday. And absolutely do. But I usually tell people, have a career first, or at least, have some kind of skill, do something of real value, make something, produce something, have a service that works for people and helps the country, and then come and use some of that skill. So we do have some businessmen, we have some doctors, we have some people who did other things, but I think it is a good idea to have more of that. And the people who are here a long time, the system beats them down until they don't think anything is possible, and everything is the art of incrementalism, and big ideas are lost, outside the box thinking is lost. We're confined by our own rules. We've been through this budget and the tax process. We are dictated to by sort of bean counters and things that restrict really the will of the people from coming forward in a lot of things, but it's because of the institutionalism and the longevity of people who are here forever and ever and ever, and they no longer, I think they get drained of the enthusiasm. They can remember that first election, but they really barely remember that first election, and that's a problem, and they forget what they promised, but they lose the enthusiasm to change the system. And there's so much status quo, so much inertia of this place that even when you're beating against it, if you don't hit it harder and harder every day, it's never going to change. And you need new blood to get that.
Yeah, you have all said that your experience in office has only made you more supportive of term limits. Congressman O'Rourke, why is that the case?
Well, I'd pick up on Senator Paul's comments. I think over time you lose the urgency that many of the issues that concern our constituents demand. And if you're going to be here for the next 20, 30, 40 years, if you get it done this year or the next or somewhere down the road, well, that's just as fine. I think having a fixed horizon will introduce the urgency that's missing from this institution, some of the political will that you find when you're not focused solely on your own reelection and raising the money to assure it. You begin to have the sole focus of ensuring that you make the most of the moments that you have in this institution, knowing that they're temporary and they won't last more than whatever the term limits might be, 8 years or 12 years, something shorter, maybe something slightly longer. I think that would go a long way towards helping us to address some of these outstanding issues, like being able to fund the government on a consistent basis, move forward on immigration reform, in a bipartisan way, address the outstanding healthcare challenges in this country. I mean, you name it. We have a host of opportunities and challenges that are not met with the seriousness and the thoughtfulness that you might have if this were not a lifetime career for members who crowd out their time with colleagues, especially from across the aisle, in favor of focusing on their reelection, on call time, on raising the resources and the alliances to ensure that they can stay here forever. I think that's not the silver bullet. I think that would go a long way towards improving our productivity and the outcomes that you see in Congress.
You mentioned something very interesting there, call time. Can you just explain to our audience what that is exactly?
So I'm elected in 2012, and I have my first orientation meeting in 2013 with the rest of the new members of the Democratic caucus, and I'm convinced, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, this happens on the Republican side as well. And they go through a typical day of what they expect us to do. And not once do they talk about, here's how a bill becomes a law. Here's how you work with your colleagues. Here's how you develop subject matter expertise on the committees where you will serve. Here is the political action committee breakfast you will start your day with, where you're going to form relationships and meet people who you will then call at this time on your schedule. You'll return some calls to constituents. You'll go to your committee hearing for 30 minutes to be clocked in. Then we expect you to come back to the boiler room where you'll do call time, calling those people who represent the special interests who have business before the same committee where you are going to be making decisions and asking them for money. And then that evening you will go to fundraisers or PAC meetings or social hours where you will meet the people and make the connections who will determine who you call the next day. And when you added up all the time that they were asking us to spend on a given day while we were here in Washington, D.C. as brand new members of Congress, 50 to 60% of it was raising money, a lot of that in call time. And it makes sense because when a race for Congress every 2 years costs $2 million at a minimum, $6 million, $8 million in some cases, and you raise at a clip of 500, 1,000, maybe 2,700 a call, you have to spend a lot of time on the telephone to do that. And what it means is that you are focused almost uniquely on your reelection or on helping your party defeat those who could provide spots in the chamber for challengers that you'd like to see get in there, and not on the business of this country. It's a deeply, deeply flawed system, and I think, again, contributes to a lot of the dysfunction that you see right now.
Right. So we've heard about lack of urgency, a lack of courage, a lack of big thinking, and big ideas. Congressman Blum, is there an example of a policy you can think of that would be different if the members up here were not so focused on self-service rather than public service?
First of all, I'd like to say, Beto, that does not happen in the Republican Party, what you just described. That's correct. That is a laugh line. Very good. Very good.
Yeah.
Nick, I'll partially answer your question. I've only been here 3 years, but I very quickly learned that this is a seniority-based system on Capitol Hill as opposed to a meritocracy. I was on a bank board, a billion-dollar bank board, in my previous life for 15 years. I was chairman of the Director's Credit Committee. All commercial loans came through my committee. I know a little bit about banking. I thought, I'm going to be on the Financial Services Committee. This should be a no-brainer. That's where I want to be. That's where my expertise is. Well, I quickly found out that it's seniority-based, and it isn't based on what your qualifications are. I think if we had term limits, there wouldn't be the seniority to have these things based on them. I also think I'm one that has stood up to my own party when I think, and I know Senator Paul has as well, when I think they need to be stood up to. I'm not afraid to do that. And our founding fathers, rightly so, were very wary of the two-party. Well, they're wary of political parties, period, much less the two-party system we have today where everything's black and white, and there's no room for gray because of special interests. But big reason, just as Beto said, is we're raising money from the special interest groups. And I go back to Iowa all the time. They say, why can't you work together? Why can't you ever meet in the middle? And I wish I had the magic answer to that. But part of it is the two-party system continually raising money from special interests who, if they're gonna write you a check, come on, let's face it, right? They expect or hope at least you vote a certain way. I'm somebody that likes to stand up to the Democrat Party, stamps the Republican Party sometimes, and vote in the interests of the voters of the 1st District of Iowa. The system we have today stands in the way of that. And I think if we could enact term limits, it's not going to make it perfect, but it's going to go 80 to 90% of the way of changing the way the swamp works.
Yeah. And when you talk about special interests, I'd like to remind you guys that it was actually Jack Abramoff, one of the worst mega lobbyists in the history of this town, who said that lobbyists despise term limits because a politician who stays in office for life is worth his weight in gold. He said lobbyists don't like to have to repurchase legislators on a regular basis. They prefer to have a lifetime subscription.
They want to own, not rent.
Exactly. So Ken, from the legal world, you're kind of on the outside here. What have you seen in terms of the corrosive effects of seniority? Sorry.
Exhibit A. No, I'm just kidding. Well, first of all, as I mentioned, and you all started off with, there does grow a presumptuousness of invulnerability on a political level, which breeds bad behavior both towards constituents and, frankly, towards others who are elected. And you talk about having to work across the aisle or with across the bridges within your own caucus. That gets harder and harder to do. The forced turnover that would be imposed by term limits, I believe, is far more conducive to civility. People will behave more normally. I don't know how many of you knock on doors, but one of the things that astounds me in politics is it is the one area, even religion doesn't have this, where people will instantly drop their manners, just abandon them, start screaming at you at the door. And I'm not talking about even when you're a candidate, like I've been and like these folks up here, but when you're just there to talk to a neighbor. And there's something about American politics that has reached a point of ugliness, even down in the neighborhood level. And I believe if we had more turnover, if we had more citizen participation, which is what the founders intended, it's what they expected. They didn't expect 40-year careers up here. And if the people elected knew they were going back to their community, not as an elected official, I think you'd see a lot different just behavior that would be more conducive to constructive discussions and debates where facts would matter more, data would matter more, and it wouldn't be the continual flame-throwing, emotional-based, one arm of the media versus another arm of the media that we have devolved to. That didn't happen overnight. It took a long time to get to that point. And it would be, frankly, a lot more merit-based. And with all due respect to all three of the folks up here, there isn't a congressional district or state in this country where someone who hasn't served in Congress isn't perfectly capable of doing just about as good a job as the person who's there now. Doesn't mean they can put it all together and run campaigns sort of against the odds, for instance. It doesn't mean they can do all those pieces. But let's not kid ourselves. Ronald Reagan said once, he has many great quotes, one of them is, if the best minds were in politics, business would hire them away. Now, I've been in that boat, so I'm condemning myself. And to Senator Paul's point about have a different career first, those experiences matter. Term limits actually forces that kind of experience into the system, even though the system doesn't want it.
Nick, can I?
Yeah, Congressman Blum.
Yeah, I just have a quote here that follows up what Ken said perfectly. It's by George Mason, and the quote is, "Nothing so strongly impels a man to regard the interest of his constituents as the certainty of returning to the general mass of the people from whence he was taken, where he must participate in their burden."
Reminds me of what John Adams said about wanting this university of rotation, population of lots of former lawmakers within the citizenry who could hold the current guys accountable. You mentioned restoring civility, Ken. I can't think of any issue that would do a better job restoring civility than something that has supermajority support with Democrats and Republicans. I mean, this cuts totally across party lines. Politicians are always saying they want to be bipartisan, and yet they refuse to take this up.
Let's make sure we draw the differentiation between the polling numbers and voting numbers.
Right.
The polls have asked this question in isolation, and obviously people are not basing their votes on it. They're just not. It is not a high priority for voters. One question might be, how might one drive it up the priority ladder? One is the gradual process that's going through some states of trying to get Convention of States resolutions so that this can be addressed on a convention basis. But I would disagree with you. I do believe there is one item that would bring greater civility to our politics and government, and that is a dramatic, I would say radical, reduction in the size and power of the government. The reason for the incivility in our process is our elections feel to many people like a life and death situation to them, whether economically or for their view of faith or culture. And the reality of the power of government, the growth of it, is that it has become that. So I'm a big fan of term limits. Tomorrow I'm going to be at ALEC advocating for a balanced budget amendment, which Erskine Bowles, I think, has the best quote of all, North Carolina Democrat, of course, who said that the balanced budget amendment would stop the most predictable financial crisis in history. Hasn't happened yet, but it is going to. If you want, this will help with civility. That's why I made that point. But I do not think it's number one. Number one is the raw power and size and scope of government. There's too much to fight over. And none of these folks, even with the best staffs in the world, can they really get a good view even of how it's operating to be able to change the course of the ship.
And a good follow-on point to that is that you wouldn't really want people purchasing lifetime office if it didn't have so much power over our lives. We wouldn't be as concerned about government if it were much smaller,
Right.
Which also goes to a point my dad always made about sort of campaign finance. He's like, well, if government did what it was supposed to be doing, if government did very little, why would you want to purchase a politician?
What does your bribe buy?
Yeah, so if government did what the Constitution intended, it would be very little. It wouldn't be involved in your lives. And it used to be, it was really important who your state representative was because government might be involved in your business at the local level, but wasn't supposed to be involved at all at the federal level. So if government was very small, people wouldn't want to abuse it by careers in politics, but they also wouldn't, special interests wouldn't want to purchase politicians if they didn't have so much power. So it is about power, and it's about government doing the right thing. And one other quick point I wanted to make is that another thing about it is it may not just be civility, but it actually may lead to conformity. Because I remember coming up as a kid and I'd say, who's that guy? That's a chairman. Who's that guy? That's the ranking member. And it's like, well, why do they vote exactly the same? So over time, you'll see some, when people first get here on either side, the people sitting way down below have honest disagreements and there's a real philosophical debate. The longer they're here, it gets dumbed down to they're exactly the same. And evidence of this is in spending. Why do we have $20 trillion debt? Who's to blame? Both parties. Absolutely both parties. And I blame mine worse than the other side sometimes because we not we, but some of us absolutely demand the military sequester go away. But to get it to go away, we got to convince the other side, and the only way they'll do it is if we give them more money too. So we're going to spend more on the military, more on social welfare, and the bottom line is the debt gets worse and spending goes up. But it's that conformity because everybody's been here long enough that I guess I want more military spending. The Democrats want more of this, so we'll all get everything we want, except for that the debt gets so massive if someday it's going to sink us all.
Yeah. Ken, you mentioned the Article 5
Right.
convention. For those of you who are unaware, Article 5 of the Constitution actually gives us two ways to obtain a constitutional amendment for congressional term limits. The first is it can be proposed by a two-thirds vote in Congress, which I think Congressman Blum referred to as the turkeys voting for Thanksgiving. And the second approach is getting two-thirds of state legislatures to call for term limits on Congress, which would allow the states to effectively bypass the swamp here in Washington, D.C. Senator Paul, what do you think of that approach?
You know, I'm for it. I've had a lot of supporters through the years that were worried about it, and they said, well, what if it comes together, they'll rewrite the Constitution and we'll no longer have a Constitution? And my response is, we haven't had a Constitution in at least 70 years that anybody obeys in any kind of form. You know, the courts pretty much quit obeying a strict construction of the Constitution years and years, decades ago. But what I would say is what would probably happen is we would gather legislature after legislature when we're this close to having a convention. Congress would wake up, and that would be the day that we'd pass term limits. Same way with balanced budget. Congress probably wouldn't let a convention happen. So I've become more in favor of letting it go because we need some kind of push. And I also do believe, those who argue for it, that you can limit people. You know, there's no reason. So state legislature appoints Ken to go to be, and they tell you you can only vote for a balanced budget amendment or term limits. Ken comes home and says, hey, we rewrote it and we got the French Constitution. The legislature now is going to say, Ken, you're fired, and we don't accept your vote. So there's two bites at the apple on this. And so I've been less frightened of a convention, one, because I don't think we obey the Constitution now anyway, but two, because I think that we need some kind of push forward, and it's never coming from up here.
Right. Congressman O'Rourke, what do you think of that? Would the threat of a potential convention coming from the states light a fire under Congress to act on term limits?
Yeah, I think that because of some of the things that we've talked about right now, about how focused members of Congress are on their reelections and maintaining their purchase on power, that if they were to sense that in their states this has become the driving priority, they're going to act on that to ensure that they are able to stay in power, and maybe that constitutional amendment only applies going forward, and current members are grandfathered. If that were the price to do it, I would gladly sign up, though I am term limited myself. I told my constituents, because I believe in them, I would serve no more than 4 terms in the House, 8 years. I'm in the middle of my 3rd term, and I'm not seeking re-election. Running for the Senate right now, and if elected, I've told my constituents I would serve no more than 2 terms, 12 years, regardless of whether or not other members are held to the same standard. I feel like you got to be able to walk the walk if you're really going to be able to lead on this. So, however we get there, and you know, you'd hope that you'd have some public pressure that would drive this here. I think it's important enough that we support it wherever it takes place.
I want to ask you about support for term limits within your party, because there
I
are
may be it. You may be looking at support for term limits, but
possibly. But that's not what the polling says. And,
Right.
and interestingly, President Obama, former President Obama, has actually voiced his support for term limits.
I didn't know that.
Saying, if you're in Congress for too long, even with the best of intentions, you become stale. The country suffers. You block fresh faces and ideas. A supermajority of Democratic voters support it. Why is it not getting more traction within your party?
I don't know, and I really do think I'm the only member that I have been able to find on my side of the aisle that supports this and is also willing to limit his own service, and has also introduced with a Republican colleague a constitutional amendment to set term limits on members of Congress. I've had colleagues who've come up and said, hey, you seem like a nice guy, but you're really missing the boat on this. If we do this, we will empower the bureaucracy. And you already have term limits because they can vote you out of office. And if your voters choose to send you back up here, term after term, well, that is their right. And I think for some of the reasons we've described, the really unfair advantage that sitting office holders have on being able to court the money from the special interests and to use the power of their office on the telephone town halls and all the other things that you can do through franking and otherwise, this is not a fair fight. But I can't wait for my party to catch up to me on this one. I think it's an important enough principle to join my colleague in the House and do our best to lead. And then I think it's really important that each of us set the example. If we truly believe in those we represent, then we are going to be willing to get out of the way, regardless of whether or not this passes, and allow someone else to take up the responsibility and do, I agree, just as good, more likely a better job, and certainly going to bring different life experiences to bear. And this Congress should, and today it doesn't in any way, reflect the 320 million people it's purporting to serve. And only when we get out of the way will it be able to do that.
Can I comment on that? I used to oppose term limits on a idealistic, principled basis, that it's a Republican form of government, not party, of course. and that you do have the opportunity to vote people out. And then I got elected, and to a state legislature. I was a state senator in Virginia, won 3 elections there. The disadvantage, no matter how you slice it or what your laws are, and of course, remember who's writing the laws, of course, will never create a fair, or I'll say balanced playing field. You can't really say it's fair. That would be penalizing the person who's in office simply because they're in office. But my view changed from being elected, and I stepped back a bit from my purist idealistic perspective on how our Republican constitutional form of democracy should work, because I do not believe the system is imperfect. It will always be imperfect. We are all imperfect. We make it up. And by definition, it's not going to be perfect. I think a system that has mandatory turnover will be far better than what we have evolved to in the representation in this country. And of course, I also believe if it happened at the federal level, there'd be a stampede at the state level. Now, some states actually have term limits, and the law on term limits came out of a state, Colorado, 5-4 decision, which is why the only option left is a constitutional amendment. And because the Supreme Court shut states down from doing it themselves to their federal representatives or with their federal representatives. So I do want to make that point that for me there's been evolution, and I would be surprised if we did exit interviews with congressmen and senators, how many of them wouldn't voice vociferous support on the way out the door for term limits.
I can already think of several examples I'm aware of. Just for our audience, Senator Paul has to leave a little bit early, so I just want to see if anyone has any questions for Senator Paul. No? Okay. Well, I have a question for you, and it is about President Trump. He ran on the issue of term limits. Many people are saying that you have a good relationship with President Trump. Have you taken his temperature on this at all?
You know, I think this is always a difficult discussion in any sort of administration. You know, when Reagan was elected, he ran on getting rid of the Department of Education. It was a very much a strong issue, and yet the person he appointed to be head of the Department of Education was a big fan of the Department of Education, so it kind of got worse. And you get an administration where I think the president's instincts and gut feelings probably don't change. So if he were here, I think he'd tell you he is for term limits. And I think probably there hasn't been much discussion or more action from him on it, and this is just a guess, is because there's so much going on that it just hasn't risen to the point. I have not had an individual discussion with him on term limits, but I do think that sometimes, and this is a real problem in administration. I'll just give you another example. The president's instincts, I agree with completely, that we've wasted trillions of dollars in the Middle East. The Iraq War was a mistake, and yet many of the appointments of the people around the president are big promoters of the Iraq War was a great thing, and we just should have put more people in Iraq War, more people in Afghanistan, and so you get this unusual thing where the instincts of the president and the public positions are one thing, and then you don't always get that because the people being appointed don't seem to be people that agree with the president's positions. And that's part of it, maybe the answer on term limits, but part of it may be just that there have been so many issues that hasn't risen up. But if I get a chance, I will bring it up with him. Awesome.
And for the record, the president doesn't have a constitutional role in the amendment process, but he's certainly got one heck of a bully pulpit that he can use to, yeah, a Twitter
A
pulpit.
few followers, yeah.
Yeah. Congressman Blum?
There's a question there and back there.
Yes, did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question for the whole panel, but I'd like to
Okay.
Paul's perspective. Y'all had mentioned term limits for judges. How do you think that would work for the Supreme Court? Say term limits were 10 years, and be worried that a president in 4 to 8 years could completely remake the court?
Restate question. Just the question was on term limits for the Supreme Court.
I've had a variety of opinions on this, and it depends on how bad the Supreme Court is acting, you know, at one particular time. And so I can't say I'm pure, you know, I've been really pure on this issue. I've tended to think that maybe having, but I think it needs to be a significant term for federal district judges, that maybe 12 years would be a good sort of term of office, and that even judges need to rotate back in and be more like the rest of the ordinary citizens. With the Supreme Court, I've sometimes been kind of leaning in the direction of, and then other times I've thought maybe lifetime appointments is better to try to get as much dispassion as you can. But I don't think any of us should be fooled into thinking that even at the Supreme Court it's dispassionate. And in fact, I always refer to it this way: they're voting. And they want to make it act as if they're sort of acting as not really a vote. It kind of is a vote, and they are influenced by their own personal and philosophical and political perspective. So I don't know. I have mixed feelings on the Supreme Court, but on the federal court, I think I would be fine with a 12-year limit. And I don't know if there is legislation. Does anybody know, is there any legislation on federal limits? There may be some out there, but I'm going to have to run. But I want to hear Ken's perspective as I'm walking out.
The Virginia does this and has an age limit. The legislature picks judges. Our trial court judges sit 8 years, appellate court 10, Supreme Court 12. At the federal level, I'd like to see all of it reach past 2 possible presidential terms. 10, 12, 15 would, I think, would be very good. It fits with the discussion we're having. Judges are different than legislators, but I also think an age limit is appropriate. It wouldn't be today what it was at the founding by any means, but those having to live out in the real world and not sit in the judgeship untouchable ever again makes sense, and especially when you pick a duration like 10 years or so, or beyond, you know the political situation is going to be different. And my expectation is that judges will put far more effort into being more idealistically good judges than the kind of personal play that Senator Paul described occurring, which does, to some degree or another, we'll never really know how much, and it varies judge by judge. Some of them are idealistic and purist about approaching their job now. But I think term limits would be far better. And like I said at the outset, I think this is something the founders would change. If they could change one thing, this would be it.
Thanks, Ken.
Nick, I'd just like to,
yeah.
if I could add, I'd like to add on to what Rand Paul said about the higher up the food chain you go here, the more similar both parties seem to be, and that's how we end up with $20+ trillion in debt. As a small business person, I tend to think like a business person thinks. And shortly after I got here, I thought one of the problems on Capitol Hill and the federal government is the incentives are upside down.
Yes, they are.
The incentives here are, in fact, perverse. There is no incentive to have term limits. There's no incentive to say no to special interest groups. There's no incentive to cut the budget. I'm on the oversight committee. We're supposed to investigate waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. And as my business partner said, waste, fraud, and abuse. Isn't that the 3 branches of government? I'll give you one small example, Nick. Waste. If we incentivized every employee of the federal government to root out waste and gave them a bonus check or a percentage of the waste that they rooted out and that they saved the taxpayers, can you imagine the army of people we would have working to reduce federal government waste? Regardless of party, I'm sure we'd agree there's a fair amount of it, correct? Yeah. If everyone in this room were incentivized financially, like in the private sector, to find it, I think that would go a long way. But yet, there's no incentive right now for... The incentive is spend the budget or we lose it, right? Spend the budget or we'll get less next year.
I'd just like to say that doesn't sound like an idea that you'd hear from a 50-year congressman.
Correct.
I mean, that is the type of fresh thinking that we need, and it's something I'm sure that you came up with, based on your business experience. And I think it's a great idea.
And as Ken was saying, I think this is why term limits need to be mandatory, because there's no incentive for us to limit our own terms today.
Let me ask the two of you, Congressman Blum, Congressman O'Rourke, you guys have formed this House Term Limits Caucus. How is that doing, and what do you hope to accomplish in the next few years?
Well, we have, I believe, let's see, there's 435 members of the House, and I believe we have 27 members of our Term Limits Caucus. One, Beto was correct. He's the Democrat representative, and so there's one Democrat, 26 Republicans. I won't speak to the Democrats. I will speak to the GOP. I will almost guarantee you every Republican House member ran on term limits. At least 95% of them did. We have 241 Republicans, I believe, in the House, and we've got 26 that are in the Term Limits Caucus. That's telling, is it not? And that hopefully it changes. And Nick, your organization, once again, thanks for holding this event. We just need more public events, and we need to engage the public. We know the public wants term limits. We need to engage them and let them know if the phones ring off the wall in Washington, D.C., something might happen. I believe in the grassroots. I love the grassroots, and that's the way things happen in this town, is if those phones start ringing off the wall. And we need to make that happen for term limits.
That's right, folks. And if you want to contact your congressman and tell him to support a constitutional amendment for term limits, you can go to termlimits.com and send him a message through our website. I want to open this up to Q&A. Do we have any questions for our panelists? Yes.
So one of the arguments that I've heard against term limits is this notion that over time in Congress, legislators accumulate sort of professionalism and expertise, I guess not only, particularly in subject areas of the committees that they're on, sort of in sort of those content areas. Is that a valid argument, or how would you counter that?
Just for the record, the question was about professionalization and experience. How important is that to being a good legislator, and how does that fit into the context of term limits? Congressman O'Rourke?
Yeah. First, I would say that is a legitimate argument, and that we, in order to be intellectually honest and have a productive conversation about this, I think we need to acknowledge that if we were successful in implementing term limits, it would not be without some cost. You would lose people, for example, who have been here for 20 to 30 years and have developed subject matter expertise in a given area. And I think there's a real cost to that. I, however, think that the benefit of recharging and refreshing this institution with the expertise and experience that lies outside of it that could be brought to bear on these problems and these opportunities, and also restoring our faith in Congress as an institution that can meet the challenges of this age, and getting greater civic participation in our government. All of those outweigh the risk that you're going to lose subject matter expertise, which is a real risk. So I try to acknowledge that when especially my Democratic friends and colleagues tell me why they oppose term limits. But I do think that we there's a far greater benefit in what we pick up. And I think you could apply the same thing. You know, the mayor of El Paso, Texas, where I'm from, is limited to 8 years total. And you could say, well, if he served for 20 years, he would know far more about how the city government works, and that's true, but we would lose out on all these other amazing El Pasoans who could serve in that position. We could apply that to the presidency, and I think, again, the same would hold true for Congress. So that's the way I typically approach it.
Yeah.
And I'm seriously not being flippant here in my answer, but I look at this as we have a federal government today that regulates too much, federal government that taxes too much, federal government that spends too much, federal government that daily takes away more of our liberties, more of our freedoms. So if the people with all the expertise, they're still here, they're in those committees, this is the end result, I'll go with the first 535 names in the Des Moines, Iowa phone book. And I had a lady come to me, she said, let's get 5 Iowa housewives to run the budget committee in Washington, D.C., and in 2 weeks we'll have that budget balanced. And that could be a bit extreme, but her point's well taken, and I think that's mentioned by Senator Paul before. So I tend to look at this as, if you think if the federal government's doing a great job today, then certainly we don't want to lose that expertise. I'm one that thinks we're not doing such a good job, and I think we should maybe do better with fresh ideas. And certainly there is an argument to be made, though, in like Department of Defense, CIA, intelligence agencies, there's embedded knowledge there probably is a good thing. But overall, I'm for fresh blood. I agree with Senator Paul. I particularly like to vote for people that have had a career before politics, that have accomplished something in their life outside of politics. I think we could end up with a better federal government. I'm interested in what Kim would have to say about that as well.
Well, I would have answered it as Congressman O'Rourke did. And yes, it's a cost. It's a legitimate argument on the other side, but the benefits outweigh it. I think these two gentlemen have covered it otherwise, but it is a legitimate argument. It's not one to belittle by any means, but it is just vastly outweighed by the benefits of term limits.
Well, on that note, it is time for us to adjourn. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming out to this. I wanted to thank our online audience via Facebook Live, and especially our panelists here today. You guys did a fantastic job. Thank you so much.
I'll do it.
Like I mentioned, if you're looking for resources on the term limits movement, if you'd like to get involved, please visit termlimits.com. That is the official website of U.S. Term Limits. Thank you.